At 7:56 on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft swooped down over Hawaii. Their target? The US Pacific Fleet at anchor in its base at Pearl Harbor. 5 US ships were hit immediately. A few minutes later, more Japanese aircraft joined in. By 8:35, 2 US battleships were sinking, 2 had capsized, and 2 were badly damaged. A 7th battleship, the Nevada, slipped her moorings and was heading out to sea when she too was caught and forced to beach. Simultaneously, Japanese Zero fighters strafed US aircraft lined up on the island's airstrips. They also shot up nearby army barracks. By the end of the attack, dozens of US warships had been sunk or damaged. 188 aircraft were also destroyed. The next day, US President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on Japan.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The stage was set. Could Japan knock out the United States with a swift blow before the huge might of America ground it down? It would become one of the great conflicts of World War II. The Allied troops mounted a brief but doomed resistance. Less than 2 months after invading Burma, the Japanese had seized the capital, Rangoon. 8 weeks later, the British had been pushed entirely out of the country. In just under 6 months, the Japanese had seized control of the whole eastern rim of the Pacific. Their Oriental blitzkrieg had been swift and crushing. Yet already, there were warning signs that they were not as powerful as they appeared. On April the 18th, 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, America struck back at the Japanese. US bombers flying low over Tokyo dropped bombs on the city close to the Emperor's Palace. Others struck Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya. The raid, authorized by President Roosevelt himself, was daring in the extreme. The B-25 Mitchell bombers have not been designed to be launched from aircraft carriers. They barely managed to lumber off the deck of the USS Hornet, which had brought them to within 700 miles of the Japanese capital. didn't diminish their effectiveness in the air. In Japan, the raids caused profound shock. After their runaway successes of the past 4 months, they had never expected an attack on their homeland. Japan's military planners now decided to extend the country's defenses. If they could seize additional strategic outposts in the Pacific, they could attack and destroy Allied forces before they even came close to the homeland. Japan already controlled much of the Chinese coast, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. They had also seized the Dutch East Indies. Now they decided to strike south and attack Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and east to take the island of Midway in the middle of the Pacific. It would mean the homeland was surrounded by a string of fortified positions. Yet even as Japan was planning its move, its operations were severely compromised, though it only realized this after the war. The United States had broken its military and diplomatic codes. By spring 1942, the US Navy's code-breaking team in Hawaii was reading enough messages to give it a remarkably accurate insight into Japan's intentions. So it was that the US Commander-in-Chief in the region, Admiral Chester Nimitz, learnt the details and timing of Japan's planned invasions of the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. If successful, they would cut off Australia from her allies. A Japanese bombing raid on Darwin had already caused widespread fear of an invasion. Most were outdated Brewster Buffaloes and were easily shot down by the more agile Japanese Zero fighters. But the Japanese attack had been blunted. Midway's defenses had not been broken. The Japanese commander, Admiral Chuiki Nagumo, faced a difficult decision. He'd kept some of his aircraft in reserve, loaded with munitions designed specifically for attacking ships, just in case the US fleet was spotted. Should he now order this reserve to be stripped of its torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs and reloaded with high explosive and fragmentation bombs for a second strike on Midway? It would leave him ill-equipped to take on the US Navy, but he calculated it was a risk worth taking. Then, just as the reloading was underway, he received unwelcome news. The US naval force had been spotted. Was this the US carrier force, or a smaller, less significant fleet of ships? Nagumo was in a dilemma. Should he continue with the second strike on Midway, or should he once again re-equip his bombers to take on the US vessels? Nagumo decided to gamble. He would push ahead with the second strike on Midway. His hope was that when the bombers returned, there would still be time to rearm them to take on the US ships. Even as he weighed the odds, the Japanese carriers were attacked by US bombers. Every available Japanese Zero fighter was scrambled before before the US bombers were repelled. Then came another report from reconnaissance planes. The US force did indeed contain aircraft carriers. Nagumo was, once again, on the spot. His aircraft were halfway through reloading, but the US carriers were a much more important target. He took a second gamble. He decided to change their weapons yet again to attack the US force. But while he did so, his ships would be sitting ducks. Almost immediately, they came under attack from low-flying US torpedo bombers. But they were old and slow and attacked without fighter support. As they approached the Japanese fleet, they were rapidly shot down. For a brief period, it looked as though Nagumo's gamble had paid off. Then, just as his bombers had been reloaded and were ready to take on the US carriers, disaster struck. US dive bombers, approaching unseen at high altitude, hurtled down on the ships. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Nagumo had gambled once too often and was now at the mercy of American aircraft. Within 5 minutes, the US dive bombers had reduced 3 of Japan's largest aircraft carriers to flaming wrecks. All would later sink. The fourth carrier, the Hiryu, had been masked by a rainstorm and that afternoon mounted a desperate counterattack. The US carrier Yorktown was severely damaged. It was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine several days later. But the Japanese fight back was short-lived. Late in the afternoon that day, the Hiryu was also hit and turned into a blazing pile. In a matter of hours, Japan's mastery of the sea had been destroyed. The attack on Midway Island had achieved nothing. But it had cost Japan its finest carriers and 332 aircraft. Well over 2,000 sailors had also died. America now ruled the waves in the Pacific. Yet Japan was still undefeated on land and a powerful, threatening force in the air. In the coming months, it would try to maximize these advantages. By summer 1942, Japanese plans to build a defensive ring of occupied territories around their homeland had still not been completed. Heavy losses at sea had frustrated their attempts to grab Papua New Guinea and islands in the Central Pacific. Japanese planners now came up with a new plan. If they couldn't do it by sea, they'd do it by land. On July the 21st, a division-sized force of experienced jungle troops landed on the northern coast of Papua New Guinea. They immediately struck west to capture Port Moresby, the capital. Progress was swift at first. The small Australian defence force was completely outnumbered. Within weeks, the Japanese had captured the main pass over the Owen Stanley Mountains. They then halted to await reinforcements before the final push on Port Moresby. The Australians also mustered new forces. When the Japanese moved off again, they now met much stiffer resistance. For the first time, Japanese troops were up against men who matched them for training, experience, and morale. The Australians stood their ground, and the Japanese were temporarily brought to a standstill. But conditions in the jungle were appalling. There was constant tropical rain. Malaria was rife. The Australians were eventually, again, forced to retreat. After 2 months of grim fighting, the Japanese were within 30 miles of Port Moresby. Then, finally, US reinforcements arrived. Through September and October, the Japanese were, in their turn, forced back. The Japanese made an heroic but suicidal stand. Many chose to die fighting rather than surrender. It took the Allies another 2 months before the Japanese were finally overwhelmed. It had been a bloodbath. "15,000 Japanese troops had embarked on the operation. Only 3,000 got away. The Japanese were in trouble. They'd lost at sea. They were now rapidly losing the initiative on land. American military might was asserting itself. There was only one alternative left: air power. Through the summer of 1942, Japanese engineers began building a string of airstrips across the Pacific. One was on the island of Guadalcanal, in the southern Solomon Islands. It was particularly well situated to threaten US convoys heading for Australia. It would become the focus of an epic battle. In July 1942, an amphibious force of US Marines invaded the island. They landed without resistance. The plan was to capture the half-built airstrip, complete it, and then turn it into a US base. But the Japanese were not ready to give up. That night, they sent in a naval force to land reinforcements and to attack the fleet of US ships supporting the Marines. In a dazzling display of night fighting, the Japanese cruisers sank 4 Allied warships and drove the rest out to sea. The Marines were now marooned, without supplies and without much of their equipment. They dug in around the airstrip. Despite constant bombardment, using construction machinery left behind by the Japanese, they pushed ahead with the completion of the airfield. Two weeks later, a group of US Wildcat fighters and dauntless dive bombers flew in. They were not a moment too soon. The next day, newly arrived Japanese troops launched a series of suicidal attacks on the airstrip. Over the following months, wave after wave of fanatical troops were thrown into the battle. By the winter of 1942, the two sides had fought themselves to a standstill, both now dug in to defensive positions. Then, in December, the exhausted US Marines were replaced by fresh troops. US soldiers now began a new push on the increasingly isolated pockets of Japanese resistance. By early February 1943, the Americans had finally won control of Guadalcanal. They had now beaten the Japanese at sea and on land. They had even denied them access to the air. The Oriental Blitzkrieg had failed. The Japanese Empire now faced a foe that was still growing in strength at a rate it could never hope to match. It was the beginning of a fundamental shift in the course of the war.